She was 8 months pregnant. 8 months. And he looked her in the eye, the man she had married, the man she had built a life with, and told her to get out. Not gently. Not with regret. With contempt. "You're poor," Marcus Hale said, standing in the doorway of the home they shared. "You've always been poor. And I am done carrying dead weight. Now, before we go any further, I need you to picture this moment." Because it wasn't just the words. It was the way he said them. Flat. Practiced. Like he had rehearsed them in the mirror, tested them for maximum damage, and decided, yes. Those are the ones. Diana Hale, 37 years old, 8 months pregnant, wearing a maternity dress she bought on clearance, stood on that front porch with one suitcase and a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She picked up her suitcase. She walked down those 3 porch steps. And she started moving. What Marcus did not know, what no one on that quiet suburban street knew, was that Diana had a phone in her pocket. And on that phone was a number she had never called from this address. Never. Not once in 4 years of marriage. She pressed dial. She said 4 words. "It's time. Send them." And then she kept walking. She made it to the end of the block before she heard it. A low, rolling sound. Steady. Controlled. The kind of sound that doesn't announce itself, it simply arrives. 10 black SUVs. Not speeding. Not flashy. Moving in perfect formation down that residential street like a quiet storm rolling in off the ocean, unhurried, inevitable, absolute. They stopped at the curb in front of Marcus Hale's house. Every door opened at once. 12 men in suits stepped out. And the woman who led them walked directly to Diana, placed a warm hand on her shoulder, and said, "Mrs. Whitfield. Your car is ready." Mrs. Whitfield. Not Mrs. Hale. Whitfield. On his porch, Marcus Hale went very still. Because that name, was on the side of those vehicles. Subtle. Tasteful. Embossed in silver. Whitfield Capital Group. And if Marcus had ever bothered, even once, to look up his wife's maiden name in a business search, he would have already known what the rest of the country's financial sector certainly knew. Whitfield Capital Group was worth $340 million. And Diana Whitfield Hale, the woman he had just thrown out of his house for being poor, 8 months pregnant, with one suitcase, was its sole heir. But here's the truth no one is talking about. The money isn't actually the story. The real story is what Diana did before she made that call. What she discovered in the 4 years of that marriage. What she endured. What she chose, quietly, strategically, with a patience that most people will never understand. And what happened to Marcus Hale after those SUVs pulled away. That's the part that will change how you think about everything. Stay with me. Because this story isn't just about wealth hidden in plain sight. It's about a woman who was underestimated at the worst possible moment, and decided that the most powerful thing she could do was let him believe it. And what happened next, no one was prepared for. Before we continue, to our new viewers joining today, subscribe and say hello in the comments. I enjoy recognizing and welcoming members of our growing family. Let me ask you something before we go any further. Have you ever been in a room with someone who had completely and totally misjudged you? Not just a small misread. A fundamental, structural misunderstanding of who you are and what you're capable of. Most of us have. And most of us know, that feeling doesn't just sting. It burns. Because somewhere underneath the hurt is a question that never quite goes away. How did they look at me and see so little? Diana Whitfield knew that feeling better than almost anyone alive. But here's what made her different. She didn't just feel it. She studied it. She understood exactly why Marcus had misjudged her. And long before those 10 SUVs showed up, long before he said the words that ended everything, she had made a decision. She would let him be wrong. But why? That's the first question you need to hold on to. Why would a woman of her resources, her education, her connections, her inheritance, choose to live beneath the version of herself that Marcus believed in? We'll get there. But first, you need to understand who Diana Whitfield actually was. Because the story doesn't make sense without it. Diana grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, the only child of Edward and Clara Whitfield. Edward Whitfield built Whitfield Capital Group from a regional investment firm into one of the most respected private equity operations in the Southeast. He was a quiet man. Deliberate. The kind of man who believed that real power never announced itself, it simply showed up when it was needed. Clara Whitfield believed the same thing. She raised Diana with one core principle, and she said it so often it became almost a rhythm in their house. Never let anyone know the full measure of what you carry. Let them show you who they are first. Diana heard that line hundreds of times growing up. She never forgot it. By the time she was 28, she had a master's degree in finance from Duke, had spent 3 years working inside the Capital Group learning its operations from the ground up, and had quietly been named in her father's succession plan as sole primary heir. Not because she was the only child, though she was. But because Edward Whitfield had watched his daughter work, and he believed in her completely. And here's where the story takes its first sharp turn. When Diana was 32, her father died. Suddenly. A heart attack on a Tuesday morning in his office. No warning. No goodbye. And Diana, who had always been steady, always been composed, fell apart in a way that surprised everyone who thought they knew her. Which is exactly when Marcus Hale entered her life. Now. Before I tell you how they met, I need you to hold this question. If Diana Whitfield was this woman, this heir to this fortune, how did Marcus spend 4 years of marriage not knowing? Because that is the question the entire story turns on. And the answer will tell you everything about both of them. Marcus Hale was handsome in the way that certain men are handsome, surface deep, carefully maintained, aware of the effect it produced. He was an account manager at a regional bank. Sociable. Charming. The kind of man who made friends easily and kept them casually. He met Diana at a grief support group. Yes. A grief support group. He had lost his mother 6 months before. Diana had just lost her father. And in that fluorescent-lit church fellowship hall, surrounded by folding chairs and weak coffee, they had a conversation that lasted 3 hours and felt, to Diana, like the first honest conversation she'd had since her father died. Marcus listened. Really listened. Or so she thought. She didn't tell him about the money. Not that night. Not because she was hiding it, but because it didn't come up. They talked about grief. About loss. About the strange loneliness of being a grown adult whose parent has died and suddenly the world feels slightly off its axis. And Diana, who had spent her whole life being careful, being her mother's daughter, measuring people before she trusted them, found herself thinking, this one feels different. But here's what no one realized, not even Diana, not yet. Marcus Hale had done his homework. Not before that night. But after. After their first date. After their second. When he went home and searched her name and found, nothing obvious. Because Diana had deliberately maintained an extremely low public profile. No social media. No press appearances. The Whitfield Capital Group website listed her father's legacy but kept her involvement quietly administrative. Marcus searched. Found a woman with a modest apartment, a mid-level job title she'd kept as a cover, and what appeared to be a very ordinary life. And he decided, she's exactly what she looks like. Which means the question was never whether Diana was hiding something from Marcus. The real question, the one that will haunt you for the rest of this story, is this. What was Marcus hiding from Diana? Because he was hiding something too. Something she wouldn't discover until the marriage was already 3 years in. Something so cold, so calculated, that when she finally found it, she didn't cry. She just went very, very quiet. And started planning. Diana and Marcus married 14 months after they met. It was a small ceremony. Intimate. Diana had wanted it that way, not because she couldn't afford otherwise, but because she'd watched too many people confuse the size of a wedding with the strength of a marriage. Her mother Clara attended. Elegant, composed, watching Marcus with the measured gaze she reserved for people she hadn't yet decided about. After the ceremony, Clara took Diana's hand briefly and said only, "I hope he becomes everything you believe he is." It wasn't a blessing. But Diana told herself it was. She wanted so badly to believe in this. In him. She had told Marcus, during their engagement, that her family had some old money. She used those exact words. Some old money. Deliberately vague. Deliberately understated. Her mother's teaching running deep in her bones. She was waiting. Still watching. Still measuring. Marcus had nodded and said, "Old money or no money, I'm not marrying your bank account. I'm marrying you." She remembered feeling something loosen in her chest when he said it. She held on to that loosening for a long time. The first year of marriage was good. Genuinely good, in the way that first years can be before reality moves in with its own furniture and rearranges everything. They lived in a house Diana had purchased before the marriage, comfortable, well located, but not extravagant. Marcus contributed to the household. Diana continued her quiet work with Whitfield Capital, operating under a title that obscured her actual role. She watched him. She always watched. And for a while, what she saw was a man trying. He was attentive. Affectionate. He remembered small things, the tea she liked, the way she needed silence on Sunday mornings, the anniversary of her father's death marked without prompting. Diana thought, maybe I was right about him. But here's the thing about careful people. They notice things other people miss. Small things, at first. The way Marcus sometimes grew distant after phone calls he took in the garage. The way his spending seemed to fluctuate, tight for weeks, then suddenly flush in ways that didn't match his salary. The way he sometimes asked questions about Whitfield Capital that were slightly more specific than casual curiosity should produce. Is your mother still involved in the Capital Group? Who handles the day-to-day operations now that your father's gone? What would happen to the firm if something happened to your mother? Each question alone, nothing. A husband being interested in his wife's family business. Together. A pattern. Diana noted them all. Said nothing. Because she was waiting for the moment when the pattern would reveal its full shape. That moment came 18 months into their marriage on a Thursday evening in March. Marcus had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter. He hadn't meant to. He'd been called away by a phone call he rushed outside to take, and in his hurry, he'd left the screen glowing. Diana walked past it to pour herself a glass of water. She wasn't snooping. She wasn't suspicious, not actively, not that evening. She was just tired and thirsty and passing through her own kitchen. But the email on that screen stopped her cold. It was from a man named Philip Gorse. And the subject line read, "Update on the Whitfield timeline." Diana set down her glass. She read. Marcus, the old woman is still the complication. As long as Clara Whitfield is operational, the inheritance stays tied up in the trust structure. Once she's gone, or incapacitated, or if your wife can be positioned as next of kin with independent control, the liquid assets become accessible. We need to be patient. You've been patient. Keep her close. Keep her comfortable. This is a long play, but the payout justifies the timeline. Don't get sentimental. Diana read it twice. Then she stepped back from the laptop, walked to the window, and stood there for a very long time looking at the dark backyard. Don't get sentimental. She thought about her father. About how certain she had been, standing in that grief support group, that she had finally found someone who understood loss because he had experienced it. She thought about the loosening in her chest when he said, "I'm not marrying your bank account." She thought about her mother's words, "Let them show you who they are first." And she understood, with perfect clarity, in the way that some realizations arrive not with chaos but with an eerie, settling calm, she understood that Marcus Hale had never been in love with her. He had been managing her. She closed her eyes. Breathed once, slowly. Felt the full weight of it settle into her body. Then she walked to the bathroom, ran the faucet, and splashed cold water on her face. When Marcus came back inside 20 minutes later, she was sitting on the couch reading a book. "Sorry about that," he said, closing the laptop without looking at her. "Work thing." "Of course," Diana said. Turning a page she hadn't read. She never told him she'd seen it. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not in the months that followed. Because Diana Whitfield had just become the most dangerous thing Marcus Hale would ever encounter. A woman who knew exactly what he was, and had decided when to use that knowledge. But here's what she didn't know yet. What she couldn't have predicted on that Thursday evening in March. 6 weeks later, she would discover she was pregnant. And that would change everything about her timeline. Pregnancy changes the architecture of your life. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't consult your plans. It arrives and rearranges everything, your body, your schedule, your emotional center of gravity. And for Diana, who had been operating with the quiet precision of someone playing a very long chess game, the pregnancy was a variable she hadn't accounted for. She sat with the positive test for 3 days before telling Marcus. Not because she was uncertain about the child, she wanted this baby with a ferocity that surprised even her. But because she needed to think carefully. Because now the stakes had changed. Before, she was a woman gathering evidence against a man who had married her for her inheritance. Now, she was a pregnant woman with a child coming into a household built on a lie. That changed things. She called her mother. Clara Whitfield listened to everything without interruption. Diana told her about the email. About Philip Gorse. About the Whitfield timeline that Marcus and this man had apparently been discussing like a business strategy. When Diana finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Then Clara said, "How far along are you?" 8 weeks. Another pause. "You need to speak to Jonathan." Jonathan Reeves was the Whitfield family's attorney. Had been for 22 years. He was 64 years old, precise as a surgical instrument, and absolutely devoted to the protection of the Whitfield family's interests. Diana called him the next morning. The meeting happened in a private conference room at a downtown Raleigh firm that had no visible connection to Whitfield Capital. Diana sat across from Jonathan and laid out every detail. Jonathan listened. Made notes. When she finished, he said, "He can't access the trust. Not while your mother is alive and the structure holds. But if he's working with someone, they may be looking for other pressure points. What does he know about your direct holdings? The accounts in your name only." Diana told him. Jonathan's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "We need to move some things. Quietly. And Diana, we need to document everything going forward. Everything. Every conversation that seems unusual. Every question he asks about the business. Dates, times, exact words." He paused, then added, "And you need to decide what you want the end of this to look like. Because that decision will determine everything we do between now and then." Diana looked at him steadily. "I want him to have nothing," she said. "But I want it done so cleanly that he can't dispute it, can't litigate it, can't drag my child's future into a courtroom for the next 5 years." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Then we have work to do." And that's when everything changed. Over the following months, Diana became two people. In the house, in front of Marcus, she was the same woman she had always presented herself to be. Warm. Measured. Slightly private. Occasionally distant, which he attributed to the pregnancy. Beneath that surface, she was building a case. Jonathan's team worked quietly. A forensic accountant traced the digital footprints between Marcus and Philip Gorse, a man who turned out to be a minor financial consultant with a history of attaching himself to people adjacent to wealth and attempting to engineer access. What they found was not a sophisticated criminal conspiracy. It was something almost sadder than that. Marcus Hale was not a mastermind. He was a man of medium ambitions and small courage who had met a grieving woman and recognized an opportunity. He had connected with Gorse through a financial networking event. Gorse had identified the Whitfield connection and coached Marcus on a strategy: marry in, be patient, wait for access to open up. It was opportunistic. Calculated. But not elaborate. Which almost made it worse. Because Diana had told herself, in the harder moments, had needed to believe, that there was some complexity to the betrayal. That it had required some sophisticated self-deception on his part. That he had perhaps once genuinely cared for her and been corrupted later. The document suggested otherwise. The first communication between Marcus and Philip Gorse predated their first date by 11 days. He had known who she was before that grief support group. He had found her through a combination of her mother's public philanthropic activities and a social connection 2 degrees removed. He had positioned himself in that room. Diana read that discovery on a Tuesday afternoon, 5 months pregnant, sitting in Jonathan's conference room. She didn't cry. She asked one question: "Is it enough?" Jonathan placed a hand on the stack of documents. "For what you want?" "Yes. More than enough." She nodded. "Then let's finish this." But here's what no one in that conference room understood, not even Jonathan, who thought he knew Diana Whitfield very well. Diana was not simply angry. She was grieving. Again. Not for the marriage she'd thought she'd known for months that was gone. She was grieving for the version of herself that had been so desperate, after her father died, for someone to genuinely see her. Who had let her guard down, just slightly, just enough. And she was grieving for her child, who would grow up knowing the story of their father. She would have to decide how to tell that story someday. How to give her child the truth without making it a wound that never healed. That weight was with her every morning when she woke up. Every night when she lay in the dark beside a man she now knew entirely. She gave nothing away. If you're still feeling this, comment "I'm still here" below. Because this story is not finished, and neither is she. Marcus, for his part, noticed nothing. This, Diana came to understand, was actually a piece of information in itself. A man who genuinely loved his wife, who had genuine emotional attunement, would have noticed the shift. Would have felt the subtle change in the temperature of the house, in the quality of the silence between them. Marcus noticed nothing because he was not paying attention to Diana the person. He was monitoring Diana the asset. And the asset appeared stable. Pregnancy proceeding normally. No unusual financial activity. Mother still in good health, Capital Group operating smoothly. Nothing threatening his timeline. He grew more comfortable as her due date approached. More solicitous, even, attentive in the careful way of someone maintaining a long-term investment. He attended prenatal appointments. Assembled nursery furniture. Said the right things to the right people. Diana watched all of it with the quiet attention of someone reading a document they have already decided what to do with. In her 6th month, her mother came to visit for a week. Clara and Marcus had always maintained a polite distance. Clara because she was still measuring. Marcus because he understood, instinctively, that Clara Whitfield was the variable that mattered most and the one he had least access to. One evening, while Marcus was out, Clara sat with Diana in the living room. The fire was going. Diana's feet were propped up on a cushion. The baby moved, a slow, rolling shift that Diana had grown to love. Clara watched her daughter for a moment, then said, "You know, don't you?" It wasn't a question. "Yes," Diana said. "How long?" 18 months. Clara closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there was something Diana hadn't seen in her mother's face since her father's funeral, something raw and real and very old. "Your father used to say," Clara said slowly, "that the most powerful position in any negotiation is knowing something the other party doesn't know you know." Diana nodded. "He would be proud of you," Clara said. "Not for what he did to you. Never that. But for how you're handling it." The fire crackled. Diana placed a hand on her stomach. Felt the baby move again. "I just need it to be clean," she said quietly. For her. "I need it to be over clean." Clara reached across and covered her daughter's hand with her own. "It will be." The documentation phase concluded in Diana's 7th month. Jonathan presented the complete case, the pre-relationship communications between Marcus and Gorse, the financial strategy they had outlined, the ongoing correspondence over 4 years of marriage, the attempts, unsuccessful, but documented, to probe Diana and Clara about estate vulnerabilities. None of it was criminal in the strict legal sense. Marrying someone for their money is not against the law. But it was more than sufficient for what Diana needed from a civil and family law perspective. And it was more than sufficient for what Diana needed from a personal one. She called Jonathan on a Monday morning and said, "Set the date." He asked, "When do you want it to happen?" She looked down at her stomach. 8 months along. The baby, her daughter, she now knew, due in 6 weeks. "I want it done before she arrives," Diana said. "I want her to come into a world where this is already finished." Jonathan said, "I'll have everything ready by end of week." Diana thanked him, ended the call, and sat for a long time in the kitchen of the house she'd bought before the marriage. The house Marcus lived in but had never owned. She thought about what the next few days would look like. She knew Marcus well enough to know how it would go. She knew his rhythms, his patterns. She knew what would provoke the response she needed. She just needed him to say it first. She didn't have to wait long. It happened on a Thursday. Marcus came home from work to find Diana sitting at the kitchen table reviewing documents, financial summaries, quarterly reports, the ordinary paper trail of her work at Whitfield Capital. She had left them deliberately visible. This was the first move. He stood in the kitchen doorway, loosening his tie, glancing at the papers with the carefully calibrated casualness of a man trying not to look like he was reading documents he desperately wanted to read. "Busy day?" he asked. "Just some Capital Group review." Routine. Diana kept her eyes on the papers. A pause. Then, how's your mother? Fine. Another pause. Then Marcus moved to the refrigerator. Poured himself a glass of water. Stayed in the kitchen a beat longer than he needed to. The firm doing well? Casual. Almost too casual. Very. He nodded slowly, like he was filing this away. And Diana thought, there it is. Still monitoring. She let the moment breathe. Then she said, without looking up, Jonathan says the succession documents are finalized. She heard him go very still behind her. Oh. He kept his voice level. It's all set. Everything in trust for the baby. Structured so that in the event of my incapacitation, Clara has interim control until our daughter is of age. A long silence. Not your husband? Marcus said, and something had shifted slightly in his voice, not much, but enough. Diana looked up then. Met his eyes calmly. Family trust, she said simply. Standard structure. And she watched his face do something she had never quite seen it do before. She watched the mask slip. Just for a moment. Just a fraction. The careful, studied warmth flickered, and underneath it, for one unguarded second, was something cold and calculating and genuinely angry. Then it was back. The warmth. The smile. The performance resumed. Of course, he said. Makes sense. He left the kitchen. Diana turned back to her papers. Her hands were completely steady. But here's the truth, she had not expected to feel what she felt in that moment. Because underneath the strategy, underneath the clarity and the carefully built case and the legal framework waiting to be deployed, she felt something crack, very quietly, in the part of her that had once sat in a grief support group and believed a man's eyes were honest. She felt the last remaining thread of what she had wanted this marriage to be, snap. And then she felt, underneath even that, a strange, clean relief. It's almost done, she thought. Almost over. But it wasn't. Not yet. Over the next 4 days, something shifted in Marcus. Diana could feel it. The information she delivered about the trust structure had done what she intended, but not in the way she had expected. She had anticipated he would become more careful. More contained. Instead, he became agitated. She could hear him on calls in the garage again. Longer than usual. Twice she caught fragments, it's locked up tight and the timeline isn't going to work and, once, with controlled fury, Gorse, I don't want to hear about contingencies. I want solutions. He was unraveling. Slowly, but visibly, to someone who knew what to look for. On Saturday, he came into the bedroom where Diana was resting and stood in the doorway with the energy of a man working hard to maintain a posture he had already internally abandoned. I've been thinking, he said. Diana looked up. About? About us. About our future. About the kind of life we're building. He moved to sit on the edge of the bed. His voice had taken on a quality she recognized, the performance dial turned up slightly higher to compensate for whatever was cracking underneath. I think we should talk about financial planning. Jointly. I want to be more involved. I want to be your partner in the real sense. Diana studied him. We have a family attorney for that. I know. But I want to be present in those conversations. I want to understand what we have. What we're building together. What we have. He said it with warmth. With the practiced intimacy of a man who understood the language of closeness even when he felt none. Diana looked at him for a long moment. I'll mention it to Jonathan, she said. It was not the answer he wanted. The disappointment moved across his face too quickly to fully contain. He nodded. Good. He stood. I'm going to start dinner. When he left the room, Diana closed her eyes. She was 8 months pregnant. Her back ached. Her feet were swollen. And she was managing the final weeks of a 4-year performance with a man who had chosen her as a target before she even knew he existed. Not much longer, she told herself. Almost done. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days before Diana's planned exit, 2 days before she intended to have the conversation with Jonathan that would set everything in motion, Marcus found something. He hadn't been looking for it. Or perhaps he had been, in the low-grade opportunistic way he seemed to move through the world. Either way, he found it. Diana had been careful. Extraordinarily careful, for 4 years. But in the haste of a particularly busy Wednesday, multiple calls with Jonathan's team, a conference with her mother, a prenatal appointment that ran long, she had left a document on the printer. A single page from the comprehensive asset summary Jonathan had prepared. Nothing deeply specific, but enough. A page showing asset categories and approximate valuations, with the Whitfield Capital Group figures visible. Marcus found it at 6 p.m. Diana was in the bath when she heard the change in the house. Sound travels differently when the emotional temperature of a space shifts. She had learned this in this house, the particular quality of a silence that meant Marcus had discovered something versus the ordinary silence of a man sitting with his phone. This was the other kind. She got out of the bath carefully, dressed, and walked downstairs. He was standing at the kitchen island with the paper in his hand. He looked up when she entered. And for the first time in 4 years, he did not arrange his face. He just looked at her. $340 million, he said quietly. Diana said nothing. $340 million. He set the paper down slowly. And you let me believe, for 4 years, that there was some old money. That's what you said. Some old money. Diana looked at him steadily. And Marcus Hale, the mask completely gone now, the performance fully suspended, let his real face arrive in the room at last. You lied to me, he said. The audacity of it almost took her breath away. You lied to me. This man, who had sat in a grief support group and manufactured empathy to gain her trust. Who had emailed a consultant about the Whitfield timeline before he'd even taken her to dinner. Who had spent 4 years monitoring an asset he had married with strategic intent. You lied to me. Diana felt something move through her, not quite anger, not quite grief, not quite relief. Something that encompassed all three and resolved into a kind of absolute clarity. I think, she said quietly, we should have a conversation. And Marcus, emboldened now by the drop of pretense, perhaps relieved, even, to be seen, to not have to perform anymore, straightened and said, I think we should. Because I've spent 4 years supporting this family, investing in this marriage, and I deserve. Marcus. Her voice was calm. Stop. He stopped. I know about Philip Gorse, she said. I know about the timeline. I know about every email. I know when you two connected, 11 days before we met. I know what you were looking for and I know what you've been doing for 4 years. The color in his face changed. I have been documenting it, Diana continued, for 18 months. My attorney has a complete record. Every conversation. Every financial probe. Everything. The silence in that kitchen was absolute. So when you say I lied to you, Diana said, I want you to sit with the weight of that sentence. For just a moment. I want you to really sit with it. Marcus was very still. And then something in him, some final calculation, shifted. And what replaced the performance wasn't remorse. It wasn't guilt. It was anger. Pure and uncomplicated. You think you're so smart, he said, his voice low and suddenly raw in a way she'd never heard. You and your mother and your family trust and your dynasty. You always thought you were better than me. From the beginning. I never thought I was better than you, Diana said. I thought you were someone different. I gave you 4 years of my life. You gave me 4 years of a strategy. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and for 1/2 second something cold moved through Diana's body. But he stopped at the island, 2 feet away, and what she saw on his face was not danger. It was desperation. I could make this difficult, he said. I know how to make things complicated. Diana looked at him. Put one hand, gently, on her stomach. No, she said, you can't. Because everything I just told you is true. And you know it. He stepped back. And then Marcus Hale did something that told Diana more about who he was than 4 years of living with him had. He decided that if he couldn't win, he would at least wound. He straightened. And in a voice he made very deliberate, he said, get out of my house. My house. The house Diana had purchased. The house in Diana's name. You want to play poor? He said, the cruelty arriving now, fully formed. Fine. You want to live like you're just some woman I married who happens to have some old money? Then live like it. Get out. Pack your things and leave. I don't need a wife who's been managing me for years like some kind of project. He was breathing hard. Get out, he said again. Tonight. I mean it. Diana stood very still. She looked at this man she had once stood in a church and married. This man she had once, briefly, believed in. She looked at him, 8 months pregnant, in the kitchen of her own house. And she thought, this is it. This is the moment. Not because it was the ending she had planned. But because it was the ending he had written. And she had learned, from her mother, from her father, from 4 years of watching Marcus Hale, that the most powerful position in any negotiation is letting the other person believe they've won. All right, she said. She went upstairs. She packed one suitcase, deliberately modest. She came back down. Marcus was standing in the kitchen, watching her. She walked to the front door. Opened it. Stepped onto the porch. She turned and looked at him one final time. Good luck, she said. And she meant it. Not warmly, but honestly. Then she walked down the 3 front steps. She reached the end of the block. She pulled out her phone. She pressed the number she had never called from this address. 4 words. It's time. Send them. The night was cool and quiet. Diana stood on the sidewalk with her suitcase, breathing the night air, feeling her daughter move slowly against her ribs. She had been standing there for approximately 4 minutes when she heard them. Not sirens. Not rushing. Just the low, controlled sound of vehicles moving in formation. Disciplined. Unhurried. 10 black SUVs, the Whitfield Capital Group crest embossed in silver on each rear window, rolled down that residential street with a quiet authority that made the entire block seem to hold its breath. They stopped at the curb. Every door opened in unison. 12 of Whitfield's private security and operations personnel stepped out. All in suits. All calm. All absolutely professional. The woman who walked directly to Diana was Maya Chen, Whitfield Capital's head of operations, a woman Diana had known for 15 years, who had attended Diana's college graduation and had wept quietly at Edward Whitfield's funeral. She placed her hand on Diana's shoulder with the warmth of someone who understood exactly what this moment had cost. Mrs. Whitfield, she said, using the name. Deliberately. Your car is ready. On his porch, Marcus Hale stood with his hand on the doorframe. He had come outside because he had heard the cars. Had assumed, what? A neighbor? A delivery? Something ordinary. Not this. He watched the vehicles. His eyes moved to the logo on the nearest window. He was close enough to read it clearly. Whitfield Capital Group. The name he had spent 4 years circling without ever quite reaching. The name on the documents. The name of the empire he had built his entire strategy around. It was on the car parked at his curb. It was on the car that his wife, the woman he had just told to leave, was walking toward. And what happened next, what really happened, was not dramatic. There was no confrontation. No speech. No final cutting words delivered for maximum effect. Diana simply got in the car. Maya settled beside her. The doors closed with the soft, expensive sound of well-engineered machinery. The procession pulled away from the curb. Smooth. Steady. Complete. Marcus Hale stood on his porch and watched his timeline drive away. Here's the twist everyone expected. Marcus would be humiliated. The divorce would proceed. His scheme would be fully exposed, the financial strategy dismantled, and Diana would emerge victorious with every asset protected and Marcus left with nothing. And yes. That did happen. Exactly as Jonathan had structured it. The divorce was handled with surgical efficiency. Marcus's attorney, who had been hired under the assumption that there were significant marital assets to negotiate, spent 3 meetings discovering that every substantive piece of Diana's wealth existed within trust structures and corporate frameworks that predated the marriage by decades and were entirely unassailable. Marcus received what the law provided, a proportional share of the limited joint accounts they had maintained. It was not a large number. He fought it, briefly. His attorney advised him, after reviewing the documentation Jonathan's team provided, that fighting harder would cost him more in legal fees than he stood to gain. Marcus signed. He moved out of Diana's house. He reconnected with Philip Gorse, briefly, and the conversations between them, which Jonathan's team had continued to monitor through legal channels, suggested a man running a post-mortem on a failed investment. Looking for what went wrong. Never quite landing on the honest answer. All of that was the expected twist. The satisfying resolution. The math resolving itself. But here's what no one, not Marcus, not Gorse, not even some of Diana's closest circle, understood until much later. The second twist. The one that redefines everything. Diana had known about Marcus and Gorse's scheme within the first 18 months of marriage. She had spent the remaining 2.5 years in that marriage deliberately. Not because she was passive. Not because she was afraid. Not because she was waiting for the legal documentation to be complete. Jonathan had enough by month 22 to proceed. She stayed because of something she had discovered in month 18 that she never put in any legal document and never told Jonathan and never discussed with her mother. A phone call she had overheard. Not between Marcus and Gorse. A different call. A call between Marcus and someone she hadn't expected. His sister, Renee. Renee Hale, who was 31 years old and living in Atlanta with 2 children, working 3 jobs, and carrying $80,000 in medical debt from a cancer diagnosis and treatment the previous year. On that call, the call Diana had overheard from the hallway outside Marcus's home office, she heard Marcus tell his sister. "I'm working on it, Renee. I told you. I'm going to take care of you. Just hold on." And Renee's voice, exhausted and raw, "Marcus, I can't keep holding on. I'm drowning." And Marcus, "I know. I know. I'm going to fix this. Trust me." Diana had stood in that hallway for a long time after she moved away from the door. She held that information for weeks. Months. She had a decision to make. Not about the divorce, that was already decided. But about something else. Because here's the thing about Diana Whitfield that Marcus had never understood. That no one who thought they knew this story truly understood. Diana was not ruthless. She was precise. There's a difference. A ruthless person dismantles everything without consideration. A precise person understands which things deserve to be dismantled and which don't. Renee Hale had nothing to do with her brother's scheme. She was a sick woman with 2 children who was drowning in debt and holding on to the promise of a brother who was trying to save her in the only way he knew how. A terrible, wrong, manipulative way, but driven, at its core, by something Diana recognized. Love. Desperate, clumsy, wrongly expressed love. Diana carried that knowledge for 2.5 years. And then she made a decision that Marcus would never know about. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, Jonathan Reeves delivered an anonymous medical debt settlement to Renee Hale's hospital creditors. The full $80,000. Structured as a foundation grant through one of the Whitfield philanthropic arms. Completely untraceable to Diana specifically. Renee would never know who had done it. Marcus would never know. No one would ever know, except Jonathan, who had looked at Diana across the conference table when she gave the instruction and said, very quietly, "Your father would recognize this." And Diana had said, "I know." Because that was the truth that the whole story had been building toward. The money was never the point. The power was never the point. The point, the thing Edward Whitfield had spent his life trying to teach his daughter, the thing Clara had encoded in every piece of wisdom she'd ever offered, was this. What you do with your power when no one is watching is who you actually are. Marcus had decided, when no one was watching, to build a strategy around a grieving woman's trust. Diana had decided, when no one was watching, to quietly clear the debt of his sick sister. That is the double twist. Not that Marcus lost. But that Diana, in winning, chose to extend a grace to someone on the periphery of his cruelty who didn't deserve to carry its consequences. And that is the moment that redefines the entire story. Because now you have to ask yourself, from the beginning, who were you actually watching? Not a woman who was wronged and got revenge. A woman who was wronged and decided what kind of person she was going to be on the other side of it. Diana's daughter arrived 6 weeks after the night of the SUVs. She named her Elara. A name her father had suggested once, offhandedly, during the first year of marriage, one of those small, genuine moments Diana had catalogued carefully because they were so rare. She kept the name because it was beautiful. Not because of where it came from, but because it deserved to exist independent of its source. Elara Whitfield. Not Hale. Whitfield. The birth was hard, 31 hours, complications in the final stage that required intervention, and a few minutes in the delivery room where Diana held completely still and breathed and told herself, "You've handled harder things." Clara was in the waiting room. When they brought Alara out, healthy, loudly announcing her arrival, exactly as demanded, Clara held her granddaughter with the careful reverence of someone receiving something sacred. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Diana, exhausted to her bones, watched her mother hold her daughter and felt something inside her, something that had been clenched for 4 years, maybe longer, finally release. The months that followed were not simple. Raising a child alone, even with resources, even with family nearby, is not simple. Diana moved into a house she had selected for herself. Smaller than the Whitfield estate, larger than necessary for 2 people, exactly the right size for a life she was building with intention. She furnished it slowly, choosing things she actually liked rather than things that communicated the right impression. She went back to work at Whitfield Capital when Alara was 4 months old, initially part-time, then fully. Jonathan and her team had managed flawlessly in her absence, but Diana had her father's instinct. She needed to be present, needed to feel the work moving under her hands. There were harder days. Days when Alara was sick and Diana was managing 3 time-sensitive deals and her mother's health had entered a new and more fragile chapter, and the whole weight of everything pressed down at once. Days when Diana sat in her office at 11 p.m. with cold coffee and the particular loneliness of being someone who carries a great deal and has learned to carry it quietly. She didn't regret the marriage. Not exactly. She regretted what it had asked of her. The years of containment. The discipline of watching someone closely without letting him know he was being watched. There was a cost to that kind of living, a toll it took on your ability to simply be present without strategy, to trust an instinct without examining it for vulnerabilities. She was working on that. Slowly. Marcus, for his part, rebuilt. Not dramatically. Not in the way of someone who had undergone transformation. More quietly, a man recalibrating after a plan failed, adjusting his orbit, finding new direction without quite understanding why the old one had been wrong in the first place. He moved to another city. Found another job. Eventually, Diana's team stopped monitoring him, having confirmed that he posed no further threat or complication. She thought about him less than she expected. What lingered was not anger or even sadness. It was the particular strangeness of having been chosen as a target by someone who had never actually seen her. Like being struck by lightning meant for someone else. The impersonality of it. The way it made her feel both aggrieved and somehow beside the point. She had been an asset to him. Never a person. And the work of becoming fully a person to herself again, fully present, fully trusting, fully there, was ongoing. She found a therapist she trusted. She told the whole story, all of it, including the parts she hadn't told Jonathan, hadn't told her mother. Including the phone call with Renee. Including the decision she'd made in Jonathan's conference room to clear the debt. Her therapist looked at her after she finished and said, "How do you feel about that decision now?" Diana thought about it. "Good," she said. "I feel good about it. Not noble, I don't need it to be noble. Just clean." Her therapist nodded. "That's important. The word clean. It's the only thing I needed it to be." And that's when Diana realized, sitting in that therapist's office with afternoon light falling across the floor, that the truth hadn't just changed her life. It had revealed who she had always been. Not her father's heir. Not Marcus's target. Not a woman defined by betrayal or by triumph. A woman who, given power and given pain at the same moment, had chosen to use the power carefully and let the pain teach her something. A woman who was, still, becoming herself. That work was not finished. But she was doing it in her own house. With her daughter sleeping in the next room. With her mother's number on speed dial. With a future she was building brick by brick, in the same way her father once had, quietly, deliberately, with her hands. That, finally, was enough. Before we close this story, I need to sit with you for just a moment. Because this wasn't just a story about money. You know that. This was a story about what people do when they think no one important is watching. About the difference between reacting and responding. About the particular, excruciating discipline of knowing something and choosing when to use it. And it was a story about what real wealth looks like. Not the fleet of SUVs. Not the $340 million trust. The decision Diana made in that conference room, to clear a debt that no one would ever trace back to her, for a woman who had nothing to do with the harm. That was real wealth. The kind that lives in character, not accounts. So I want to ask you something. And I genuinely want to know your answer. What would you have done? If you had discovered, 18 months in, exactly what Marcus had done, would you have stayed? Would you have left immediately? Would you have done what Diana did, stayed, gathered everything, and left on your own terms? There's no wrong answer here. Because circumstances determine what's possible, and not everyone has Diana's resources or Diana's support structure. But the principle, the idea of responding rather than reacting, that's available to all of us, regardless of what we have. Here's the question that's going to divide the comments today, and I want you to weigh in. Was Marcus purely a villain, or was there something in his desperation to save his sister that made him, at least partially, human? I've been sitting with that one since I first heard this story. I don't have a clean answer. I suspect you don't either. Comment below. Tell me where you land. And tell me this, which moment hit you the hardest? Was it when Diana stood in that hallway overhearing Marcus's phone call with Renee and chose to hold it without using it as a weapon? Was it Clara's words, "Let them show you who they are first," echoing through the whole story? Was it the moment Marcus said, "You lied to me," and the sheer breathtaking audacity of that sentence coming from him? Or was it something quieter? Diana naming her daughter Ilara and keeping the name because it deserved to exist, independent of its source. Tell me in the comments. I read every one. Now, if you thought this story was something, wait until you hear what comes next. Tomorrow's story is about a man who spent 20 years being the most overlooked person in every room he entered. A man his colleagues never bothered to learn the name of. A man whose company's flagship project was presented by someone else, credited to someone else, celebrated by someone else. And what he did with the 20 years of work they never saw coming, that is a story about patience of a different kind. A slower burn. A longer game. You're going to want to be here. Subscribe now if you're not already. Stories like Diana's, like what's coming tomorrow, these are not summaries. These are not highlights. These are the full, breathing, human accounts of people who were tested at the deepest level and showed us what it looks like to meet that test with dignity. That's what we do here. And we're glad you're part of it. Comment below, tell me where you're watching from, tell me which moment hit hardest, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. We'll see you tomorrow.